Hi, everyone. Welcome to the final lecture in the spring lecture series here at SCI-Arc. It's always a great pleasure to welcome a colleague and a friend to the Keck podium. So tonight, I'm really happy to welcome Izaskun Chinchilla. We just had a really interesting discussion upstairs in the SCI-Arc library, in the SCI-Arc channel series of interviews where I think some of the things, what really struck me about my conversation with Izaskun was her emphasis. There were a lot of verbs. Izaskun was talking about things like hacking, caring, words that don't often, the word caring, I became very curious. What could caring in architecture, caring for architecture, an architecture of caring, how do we create care in architecture? I think it's something that we'll hear about tonight with some of Izaskun's projects. And it really struck me as something that is so important for us to think about today. There are a lot of discussions about how our discipline is changing, how the role of the architect is changing, how that evolving role might begin to impact the built environment. And speaking of environment, the way that I got to know Izaskun was almost a year ago here at the SCI-Arc Gallery when Herwig Baumgartner and I curated a show called Environmental. And I remember for that show, Izaskun proposed 6 ways that we can make you a forest as architects, creating a forest, thinking about what that could mean in terms of different modes of working with everything from patterns and textures that might be derived from other sources that we might consider to be from a natural environment that suddenly get integrated into a synthetic environment. Things like the way that light might pass through trees. Everyday objects, the role in which those can take in terms of creating an identity, creating a series of suggested multiple histories for spaces, turning spaces inside out. One of the projects that I really appreciate is a project where windows, existing windows are recycled and turned to look into the architecture. So instead of us looking at architecture, what would it mean for us to look into it? Who is the subject then, and how does that change our understanding of the subject? And so I think that all of this kind of, the way of working really suggests also different narratives for the spaces we create, and the way in which the identity of things that we think are kind of everyday or generic suddenly become more extraordinary. Some of the work deals with industrial products that get transformed, or even products that come from a kind of supply chain, like something like IKEA, where what would be generic now has an owner and becomes kind of reappropriated and re-identified and kind of imbued with a different kind of architectural presence. So I think these are all issues that really, this question of caring makes me think of how Bruno Latour talks about matters of concern, the things that might concern us. Some of these topics and some of the research that Izaskun is doing, the words environmental maybe suggest something very vast and something a little bit out of the scope of something we can grasp on an everyday level. But I think that Izaskun's approach to an issue like that is done in such a way that it makes it accessible to an audience who may not only be an architectural audience. There are projects that deal with how to encourage children to ride bikes to school. How could we do that? What role could we as architects have in changing the way we use spaces in our urban environments or in our rural environments? So I really look forward to hearing about these projects. And now for the more formal side of my introduction, Izaskun Chinchilla graduated from the Universidad Politécnica de Madrid. She has led her own practice since 2011 and is a senior teaching fellow and researcher at the Bartlett. She's also taught at the École Spéciale in Paris and the Head University in Geneva. And a number of other places that, there's a very long CV here, but her professional practice is accompanied by a research project called Social and Aesthetic Repercussions of Technical Topics and Solutions which Take Ecology into Account. And in that capacity, Izaskun has also been a visiting scholar at Columbia University, the École des Mines de Paris, Princeton University, and the Institut d'Architecture Avançada de Catalunya in Barcelona. As a speaker, she's participated in many forums, lectures, and debates. Numerous magazines and publications have published proposals from her office. Exhibitions include 2 editions of the Venice Biennale, the São Paulo Biennale, as well as traveling exhibitions, the New Trends Europe, Asia, Panorama Emergente Iberoamericana. And she has also exhibited in museums such as Liga in Mexico City and Mad is Mad Gallery in Madrid. So I would also ask you to keep an eye out for these topics that we just spoke about, the issue of caring, the issue of hacking. There will be an interview, a SCI-Arc channel coming out shortly that documents that conversation, and I would like to ask you to join me in welcoming Izaskun Chinchilla to SCI-Arc. Thank you.
Hi. Thank you so much, Marcelyn, and the whole SCI-Arc for the invitation, and thank you guys for being here, because I know it's a stressful moment of the year, apparently, so I really appreciate. I have tried to make a summary of the activity we are developing, both in the practice and in other activities that we are doing in parallel. And I could say that our professional activity is supported by three main activities. The first one is, let's say, carrying on with an architectural practice, as difficult as it is at the moment in Europe and particularly in Spain. Also researching in the Bartlett School of Architecture more than in any other place, and teaching, especially teaching with empirical and experimental methodologies, so that these three activities are really connected together. And we understand research probably as the linking element between practice and teaching, so that if teaching is the big laboratory that is allowing us to accelerate the conclusions of our hypotheses, and design is the main way of testing and evaluating those hypotheses, research is something in the middle, creating a kind of sharing format that we hope is useful for others. In this kind of critical and reflective attitude, we have tried to summarize an easy question, that is what we are good at, what we are doing well at the moment. And that has taken us to this triple division of our work. We think most of our projects are always having an element of ecology, an element of critical attitude towards technology, and an element of sociological research and understanding. In terms of ecology, we are looking at circular economy, trying to understand how persistencies are operating. We try to work in biophilic design and low-impact projects. In terms of technology, you will see with the projects that I'm going to show you, we are trying to work with both recycled and organic materials, with cold spaces that are turned into warm, hacking industrial products. We have a whole expertise in delicate details, something that we think has been pretty forgotten in the architectural contemporary culture, comfort, coziness, and a new vision of art and crafts. And in terms of sociology, we are trying to empower the user through do-it-yourself practices, also transforming consumers into makers as a political attitude, and trying to build the idea of social capital being probably the main heritage of architectural design, public engagement, and gender-sensitive project. It's a very short introduction, but I think it creates a little bit the panorama or the scenario in which we are trying to practice. I'm a doctor from a couple of years ago, and my thesis was called the structure of the ecological revolution in architecture, thinking and trying to prove that if ecology is taken on board seriously, it's changing everything. It's not an addition, let's say, energetic awareness that you can add to the previous way of doing architecture, but it is changing radically the roots in which we are designing. We are trying to make that hypothesis and those research accessible to many, many different people through social media. So we are trying to modulate this research so that it can be communicated to different audiences. In this effort to communicate the different audiences, we have gone with these theorems that are mainly expressed with visual tools, and that are trying to change the methodology that students, young architects, and established architects are using to create architecture. In today's lecture, I'm going to explain 4 of these principles that we think are somehow revolutionary. And they are not revolutionary because of the work we're doing, but because of the potential that they could have in changing and shifting the architectural paradigms we are dealing with. The first topic I would like to talk about, and the first principle, is the change and the shift in the technical hierarchy that we are using as architects. Sorry, because I'm combining Spanish and English written information, but I hope I will be able to explain this. When I was studying a quite modern movement tradition university in Madrid. This was the hierarchy that was established in architectural design. As architects, we were considered to, let's say, to think about the structure as the main and fundamental technical element of the architecture, whereas communications were slightly less important than enclosures, then finishes, and then details. Details and finishes could be done by an interior designer, so they were like not so important elements. With the years of practice, we are trying and we are consciously trying to adopt this other approach to architecture, in which details are more important, or the thinking about details happens previously to decisions about finishing, communications, enclosures, or structure. And the reason why we are doing that is because if we look, for example, at this room, the elements that are affecting our use of the space are much more this microphone, the light, or the projector, the beamer, or this computer, than the structural columns that we have around. The lecture couldn't happen probably with the computer crashing, but probably the structure is never going to crash. So if we think about it in terms of using the space, the spatial presence of the details are much bigger. If we look at this acoustic ceiling, if we look at the microphones, what we see around is mostly details. And the structure might be hidden. In most of the lecture halls I'm talking, structure is even invisible. So we think that inverting the hierarchy of this pyramid is taking us closer to the user experience of the space. In particular, we are trying to look at how different users are having different experiences of the space, and therefore details has to follow many different agendas, and not just one. So subdividing the details allows us to go into different, let's say, profiles of users. In fact, if we think about those guys that are recording with the camera, these devices are super important for them, whereas for you, probably the chair is more important. So there is a kind of different hierarchy that is depending on the particular specific use of the space, and of course about the diversity of backgrounds, ages, bodies, and cultural circumstances of every user. So we are trying to make it accessible, the technical knowledge of the architecture to general users by first introducing a new hierarchy of technical elements, starting with details, but then also subdividing those details so that they can be grabbed and they can be used in different ways, and so that they can take you further in the understanding of issues like carbon's impact, pollution, or side effect of design. To illustrate this principle, I'm using this project that we make in New York City around 3 or 4 years ago. It was the result of a competition called City of Dreams, international competition. And the idea of the competition was to do a fully cradle-to-cradle design for a pavilion in Governor Island. Governor Island, as you might know, is an island that is 3 minutes by boat from Manhattan, but it's only used or is only open to the public 3 months per year. The rest of the time is used by the government for security reasons. And there is a claim, a land claim, and a political claim in this area for it being public for the whole year. And several NGOs are working in site-specific land pieces in the summer, trying to, let's say, create a conscience on the right of the use of this area of New York as a public park. The ethos of the competition was to create something not only from recycled materials, but that could be used afterwards, let's say, again, as new installations afterwards with this logic of fully cradle-to-cradle philosophy. So what we did was proposing a pavilion and building a pavilion using around 550 bicycle wheels that were collected through 3 months in New York bicycle workshops, around 350 umbrellas, 120 photographer tripods, and the central part of the car wheels, around 70 of them. That was creating this structural pattern or scheme in which we were combining trees, tree structures, with domes of different scale, so that the combination of both of them could allow a stage for storytelling, musical performance over the summer, and a shadow environment in this protected area of the city. It was also quite important that the whole pavilion should be put together by volunteers. It was 45 volunteers working in total in the pavilion over 3 weeks of construction. So this idea of inverting the pyramid was not only a theoretical background, but even a physical necessity, because we were not going to have cranes and lorries and big physical elements, but just the body of 45 people with no previous training in architectural technologies. So I will try to show how this principle of inverting the pyramid was working in this project. First, because we are starting through the details, we consider that a structure is something that can be reconfigured. So we try to go for soft structural strategies. In this case, we were not completely sure of how much money we were going to have, so we proposed a $4,000 installation that was just consisting on these trees, combining the umbrellas, the bicycle wheels. We were also offering a 12,000 configuration in which bigger domes were appearing, and we offer a 22,000 configuration for the pavilion that was introducing a bigger dome in the center, allowing around 200 square meters to be useful. We were selected in a first round, and then the most difficult part was the structural and technical development. So as you see, what is very interesting for us is that the details can help users grasping the technical knowledge that is underneath. The difficult part of the structural consideration was that, as you see, all the materials were super light, and the wind in the island was especially strong in summer. It was 3 hurricanes over the 3 months that were there. Sorry, I'm a bit hot. And therefore, the structural strategy was really important. We were working with prototypes. We think empirical approach to materiality requires many times physical fabrication of full-scale prototyping. And with that, we discovered that creating a continuous dome, a continuous layer, tightening together all the bicycle wheels, could allow us to have a structure that was resisting the vertical down-up direction of the wind. So in here you see how the relationship between the trees and the domes is happening. Big dome in the center, small domes connected with 3 trips in the perimeter, and how the loads are working like a dome and an arc in the perimeter. In this sense, many technical hypotheses were developed. Structurally speaking, we were working with micro-redundancy and looking at how, because we know that the recycled material is going to fail. It's a new way of approaching structures. So what we study is the way in which the fail is going to be produced, and what we try to prevent with different technical and material strategies is this failure happening in a too, let's say, intense way. So you see strategies like extra stability, and you also see how these technical details were done after prototyping. So for us, it's very important that we are starting with the domestic objects we are going to deal with, and then we go for the technical details. Absorbing in the technical thinking issues about the use. For example, the foundations were combined with benches and seats, so that the load of the user when sitting could help the stability of the side, or dealing with issues like, the wind strategy. In here you see some more redundant strategies, or what is called capacity design in the joints, so that we were trying not only to work with the stability of the whole piece by bracing, but also working with the stiffness of the joints in what is called capacity design. This is very important for us. What is a challenge for us is how to present this to the user, and in this occasion, to the people that were contributing to the construction, the volunteers, as an accessible technical knowledge. So after prototyping, to gather the volunteers together in the island, we were prototyping in Spain, we create this brochure in only bringing some pages, so that the volunteers could anticipate which one was going to be the learning and the acquisition of tools that they were going to have. So in this booklet, you could see what were going to be the activities you will be doing if you enjoy and enroll, and which will be the technical learning that you will be creating. So this is how we interpret this idea of inverting the technical hierarchy. We think the technical knowledge is important, but it has to happen after an accessible communication strategy. These are some of the booklet images. Also, it was important that the pavilion was fully funded by a Kickstarter campaign. And for us, it's, again, one other way of dealing with these technical issues. So if usually the funding or the budget is a technical aspect of the project that is hidden or not very accessible, in this time it's about convincing 470 people to donate $40 to create a structure. And also it's important for us to record and we track and we follow what is happening in social media and how people are taking pictures of our spaces and how people are actually commenting, appreciating, and understanding them. There is even a physical condition with this inversion of the pyramid. That is, we are creating material details that are more balanced with even the weight of the body of the people that are using and making it, so that there is a bigger capacity of transforming the environment because you can really cope with the loads that are around. This is the dismantling process. As you see, I'm not super strong and I was contributing quite successfully. And this is how all the details, for example, the foundations were some of the most important parts because we were not allowed to dig, so it was like easy to disconnect. Okay. This inversion of the technical hierarchy, of course, has not only been promoted by us, but it has also been promoted by other people like Naomi Shore in the 80s. In this beautiful book, Reading in Detail, Naomi Shore was proposing that the selection and preference of the sublime in the architectural culture was a highly macho and anti-feminist decision, because the sublime, the idea of architecture being abstract, being heroic, and not containing any reference to daily objects or daily life, was erasing the whole female background for a group, 50% of the population or more of the world, that has been taking special care of details. Having flowers at home, making cozy environments, making comfortable rooms, or making nice food. So Naomi Shore is precisely accusing different cultural activities like writing, literature, painting, architecture, and many others, even filming, of, let's say, erasing details as a way of erasing also the female sensibility and approach to space. In our opinion, that is something that we have to claim strongly, and we are trying to do that. So we are trying to recover and reconnect with these daily experiences of the space and to claim the central position they should play in the architectural experience. This is a project that we did for Madrid region and City Hall, and it is a big pavilion for a big stand for an important tourist fair. It's happening every year at the beginning of the year in January. It's the second biggest tourist fair in the world. It's happening in Madrid. And we have to deal in this occasion with two political parties that were completely, let's say, difficult to put together because the region is really, really conservative and right-handed, and the council is really, really left-handed. And the stand was for both of them together. So it was difficult to come with a negotiation. They were not talking to each other, so it was us going from one place to the other, from one institution to the other. So it was difficult to find the definition of what is Madrid as a city that will join everybody's background. So we started trying to draw and illustrate views of Madrid as a city that are defining a very special thing, that is Madrid is considered as one of the most welcoming cities in Europe. And that is a statistic. I mean, most of the workers working for multinationals that are asked, where do you want to work in Europe, choose either Madrid and Barcelona. Barcelona is more beautiful. I'm from Madrid, but I have to be honest. But it's true that Madrid, without the monumental fact that Paris, Vienna, or other European capitals are having, is really welcoming. And we were trying to, let's say, avoid the hypothesis is because people is nice, is because the weather is great and the food is quite good, and try to see if there was something in the formal aspect of the city that was encouraging this welcoming condition. And we found a couple of keys. This first drawing is about the topological depth. This is a street market that is called El Rastro, in which a lot of stuff is selling the street on Sunday. And if you see, there are several planes that you can see. There is a sailing activity, there is a public shop activity, and then there are, let's say, deeper views that you can have from the public space in the private one. And that condition is happening all over the most characteristic spaces of Madrid. So topologically speaking, it's a city that is depth. There is a contribution and a view of the private life within the public space. That is happening as a systematic element all over the city. And the second element we were studying were the squares. Squares are areas of socialization that are still working amazingly. This is Plaza Mayor. And statistically speaking, if you go there, it's quite easy that you are invited to a party or a dinner. Just because people is sitting there, it's easy to get to know locals. The urban space has always created this opportunity by its configuration. So with this double consideration, on one side, the square as a socialization opportunity and the topological depth of the architecture, we were trying to look also at the region and try to see if these elements were repeated and could be considered a systematic feature of the architecture. Once we explained that to both of the institutions, we came with this design in which the main space is a square full of events, animated, in which the events are, let's say, the ones that are creating the identity. I think this is a challenge for architects because many times we think it's all about the container, but most of the times it's about activity. So we decided that the activity was going to be the most important core. So the plaza, the square, is the main space in the center. It's a quite big stand, it's around 1,500 square meters. And then we were trying to incorporate the two other findings that we were doing with the graphic research in the perimeter, so that we honor the market, the El Rastro, establishing in the whole perimeter 52 stalls, market stalls, in which the different stakeholders for both institutions, Madrid Region and Madrid City Hall, could have their own space That could be Real Madrid, the museums, and all of these people. And for us, it was very important that wherever and from any direction, when you approach the stand, you will always find a face and a person to talk with. It was around 100 people working in the stand. And then we'll try to recreate these topological depths of the facade, and also a very important fact that is Barcelona is beautiful and monumental, and Madrid is nice because it's full of balconies that are anonymous, but somebody's taking care of them, and there is always a beautiful color, a beautiful plant, and a beautiful thing there. So we were honoring and reproducing the anonymous balconies of both the region and the city with this architecture. In the analysis of the facade, we also introduce an environmental compromise. I will show you the relationship between the drawings and the making of the building. The environmental compromise is always difficult for us when we are talking about pop-up architecture. We are doing a lot of that, and it's always depressing when the pop-up thing ends and you see all the leftovers. So we decided to propose both of the institution a quite a strong environmental policy. So we tried not to use any structure out of the ones that we could rent. This took us to use only these trusses that are hanging, and all the materials are hanging from them. These are rented, and we are not having any other structural element. We were also using reuse elements because we were working for the city hall. We could use and have access to a lot of these security benches in which, and fences, and we could do with them the stalls, the additional hanging elements that we needed, and the regulation of the circulation. And also, we were using low-impact materials as cardboard and nautic buoys that were also rented by the city hall, and textiles and cloth. So this is like the connection between. So as you see in here, again, we are starting with elements like having a stall, having a face, talking. And from that element, we go into more technical disquisitions and understanding of how environmental impact is happening. So there is a way of grabbing the detail that takes you to further technical knowledge. In fact, we were proposing this to all the stakeholders. Usually architects tend to, please not put any object, everything should be clean. And we tell them, please bring everything you have so that it's looking like a street market. And the advertisement and communication of your activity is having a material presence. It's not only about you talking, but it's also about you showing things that you do. Of course, we are, going into a quite wild fabrication process, because working with recycled materials and reused materials is usually taking us to quite strong, let's say, do-it-yourself conditions, and we try the hands of the people that has contributed to the architectural building to be still visible. And there is always a combination of digital fabrication tools with CNC and 3D developing, and very, very local craft techniques that are done by hand. Okay, second principle I would like to introduce is the idea of solving for pattern, and that's the strategy that Wendell Berry, a person coming from, in the US, coming from agricultural studies, was proposing. and how we are adapting this to architecture. What Wendell Berry says was that many times when architects or people that are changing the environment are doing something like a building, they tend to look at things like the building should be slightly higher than the previous one, or the technology should be slightly more advanced. And they are ignoring things like the water conditions around, there are families around their buildings that are going every day to school, or that there is a biodiversity condition in the city that is depending on the building. So Wendell Berry says a first advice for any designer that is changing the environment is recognize the pattern. Recognize that many things are already happening in the location you are working in. If you remember the first slide I was showing with what we do well, we were talking about this paradigm of the world is already full. It's not empty till the architect comes. So first thing that we do in any of the projects we are doing is trying to draw the patterns, draw what is already happening in the place in terms of social capital or environmental capital. The proposition from Wendell Berry that we are bringing to architecture is that we should, let's say, adapt our own structures and strategies to the existing structures of the patterns that are there, so that the more similar what we are doing to is to issues like the structure of the paths, the structure of the local associations, the more successful and the more adaptable our architecture could be. And one other thing that is very important for us is always knowing and always taking on board that we might be wrong and that the side effects of what we are creating might be worse than the advantages that we are allowing to happen. So for us, it's very important to introduce a reversible condition in architecture so that in the case we are doing something wrong, architecture should be dismantled, should be changeable, or should be transformed into something else. And this is requiring a bigger scope and a bigger vision of the timeline of the architectural project. To illustrate that, I have brought the refurbishment of Carci Castle. It's a medieval castle in Spain. It's a project that is a public project that took us around 13 years. And it was very complex because heritage in Spain is in a complex situation. We are the third world in UNESCO heritage places after Italy and China. And at the moment, we all think that having a castle in a small village that is only 100 inhabitants is a super great thing. But in the practice, in Spain, we have 4,000 fortified structures and more than 600 castles, and only a small proportion, less than 20% of them, are in good state. So what the Spanish regulations say is heritage should be maintained forever, but we don't have money for that. That's an easy way of saying that. And obviously, a small village that is having 100 inhabitants is not able to cope with the presence of the heritage element and to pay for the expenses. So when we found the place, it was really decayed. It has been used as a cemetery for years. It was full of structural problems. And of course, there was a big work in retrofitting the existing architecture. But also, there was a strong decision of how to make it sustainable financially. So we decided, we took a couple of important decisions. The first one is we were not wanting to spend any money in energy. So it's a completely outdoor space. in which the main intervention is a platform that covers the weapon courtyard, that is around 1,500 square meters, and is covered with a double-layer platform, metal grid on top and glass on the bottom. That creates increase of temperature in the basement. You will see what is not a basement, but is the underneath space of around 8 to 9 degrees Celsius in winter is the increase, and a decrease, equivalent decrease of temperature over the summer. This easy strategy combined with these 42 solar chimneys allow us to use comfortably the building without any heating or cooling expense or waste over 9 months in the year. So the building at the moment is open to the public 9 months, from March to November. Also, it was very important for us to discover this idea of the local patterns. A medieval castle, is usually located in the landscape, in a particular topographical situation. In this case, it's very important to come to the coronation and the top, so that you understand that it was a defensive location in which you are able to see from here the coast in Valencia, that is 175 kilometers away. So there is a long view, and it's the only topographical point in the region in which this is happening. In terms of showing how the research and the practice are, let's say, connected to each other, I'm bringing here some of the folios we are doing at the Bartlett School of Architecture, proposing that the buildings we are doing is the research that our architects are doing. This wouldn't be acceptable in Spain, but fortunately it is acceptable in the US. So what we try to do is try to show the research question that the building is containing. Issues like how light and semi-permanent architecture can help the introduction of new uses in the historical remains, how flexible building solutions can manage the future sustainability of heritage, how the Mediterranean culture of using outdoor space can help the decrease of energy consumption. So in here, you're going to see a connection between the writing, the thinking, and the hypothesis that we were dealing with, and the making of the actual making of the building. In general, the program was a very important part of the architectural, let's say, refurbishment. For us, activities, as I'm trying to express, are equally relevant than containers. So we established a program that was about computer literacy, because it's a very rural area of Spain. It's almost a desert at the moment. And the digital bridge, the digital gap is really, really important. We were also considering only working with local workers. But all this is creating an overlapping of patterns that are coming from the social, political aspect to the environmental and technological aspects. One other explanation of how we are finding the local patterns and trying to apply similarity to our structures is the lower part of the remains. In fact, when you see the building, when you see the existing castle, you tend to think that it's a building, but it's a collection of remains coming from Arab times, 12th century, to the 19th century. And this transition from the basement to the top of the building happens in different moments of history. So archaeologically speaking, there are at least 2 or 3 castles that are overlap, and we try the new structure to allow the user to understand that. So when you see this structure, we subdivided the building or the structure into 6 centimeters columns, very slender ones, separated 1 meter, and the position of the columns were put so that it was easy for the visitors to recreate the original space in the Arab citadel that they are visiting without reconstructing the previous space. Also, the whole space is fully reversible. In here, we are going to see not only the reversibility, but also the environmental issues. These are the solar chimneys. This is the prototyping stage. And they work because the heating, solar heating, creates an overheating of the air in this area. And when this skylight is open, the ventilation happens spontaneously, so that the air is taken cold from the basement of the church, and is creating this spontaneous ventilation of the lower area. In here you see the combination of these solar chimneys that are also showcasing three-dimensional objects, and some umbrellas that allow you to be protected from the sun and protected from the rain. It was very important for us to introduce the reversibility of the building, so that accepting that heritage should be maintained forever requires probably changing the future program. So one of the most difficult elements were the foundations. Reversible foundations and dismantleable foundations are quite challenging. So we were using micropiling and then having a 13 centimeters diameter steel pipe that was screwed to these bigger beams with all the columns on top. So dismantling is just taking these columns off. They are not even welded, as you can see here, unscrewing the beam and cutting this element. And that will allow the dismantle of everything. These are details of how all the joints are screwed or knock or clip, so that all these reversible elements were happening, and how the understanding of the space is underlined by the color and the light. This question of reversibility applies differently to different elements. For example, this is a staircase in which the only force that is putting the elements together is gravity. There is no welding or joints. It's just a collection of timber pieces and metal pieces that are stuck on top of each other, and how this reversibility applies to every element, so that you see there is a systematic use of slender elements that can be dismantled and taken apart by two people. That means they shouldn't be weighing more than 40 kilos. So you see that all the elements are strictly light in their configuration. Well, there are many more issues about local patterns, like the use of the space at night, which is a highly Mediterranean question, because in Mediterranean weathers, from May to October, the nighttime, especially between 9 o'clock to 12 or 1 in the morning, is socially very interesting in small villages, because it's the moment in which the weather is mild. And then people tend to go to sleep quite late. And we were trying to look at also these kind of patterns, or avoiding programmatic elements like a hall by introducing this double queue system. One is just for going out, the other is for going up, and it's just requiring some protection from the sun and the rain, but the rest can be open without requiring any kind of energetic consumption. And this is the lift. That was a super strong battle with the heritage institutions, because they were not allowing us to introduce the lift because it was changing the highlight of the building. But we were saying, without accessing this place, and it's the only castle that allows handicaps to go to the coronation, you don't really understand the pattern, the defensive pattern, and you cannot see this. So in here, we were fighting for everybody to be able to come. And we were introducing this idea of the pattern by making the floor with these manhole elements that were donated by different villages that have a relationship with the castle, and the manhole elements are orientated in the direction of those villages, and also bringing some samples of the local species that are growing around, so that from here you could interpret the panorama that you were seeing. The third principle I would like to introduce is, let's say, insisting on this idea of the world is already full. We are not creating it. We are just intensifying, changing, rearranging, reconnecting it. So we are always advising architects and students in architecture to consider that they are only doing half of something. The other half is already there. It's just a question of finding and activating it. We always have a vision in which we are doing like the only half of the orange. In Spanish, there is a very beautiful expression that is, you have to find the other half of the apple, and that is your perfect partner for life. So we think that you have to find the other half of your project, and your project is somewhere already there. In that sense, we think that exploring patterns, but also irregularities of the context, can help bringing identity and bringing strategy, philosophy, and critical position to your own project. So singularities plus patterns brought from the context to the project can extend the idea of identity into something that is wider and more engaging for a bigger community. To illustrate this, I'm going to show a couple of projects. One is the one of the competitions that we have recently won is in the south of Spain, in a beautiful region called Malaga. And it's a camping project in a natural park in which this trekking path is starting. It's a very impressive trekking path because it goes through a cliff and it's almost hanging from the cliff. And I'm bringing the competition boards just to show you two ways of introducing this idea of the local identities within the project. In this particular project of the camping, the particularity of the area is that it's having an enormous biodiversity, especially in terms of birds. There are more than 1,000 species that are living in the area. So our first decision was to do a completely bio-organic, using biological materials and organic materials, looking at the possibilities or promoting the possibility of birds nesting in the architecture that we were going to do. And the second decision was to organize the space in a way in which it was easier for humans to understand the birds' necessities in terms of living necessities. So decisions like the distribution, let me go further, the distribution of the water pools were very fundamental because most of the people tended to imagine a big swimming pool, whereas we were subdividing the water tanks into smaller pieces, fully natural, purified, and integrated within the residential areas, so that the nesting of the birds was more possible because of this proximity between water and nesting elements, but also the humans were starting to establish habits, daily habits, that were more connected between them and the birds. In terms of typological research, we have again deal with fully reversible architecture that is using very few physical elements and auxiliary elements to be constructed, and that is not requiring any foundation, so that biomaterials and movable elements are, let's say, the main resource. In here you see a little bit of the architecture we are developing at the moment, and construction is starting in January. So it's one of the projects that we will see in the future. I would also like to show this building we have just ended. It's not yet published. The pictures were made a week ago. And it's in Barcelona. It's a co-working space. And we were working a lot in finding these local features to introduce them in the building. The building is happening in Gracia. It's a very special place in Barcelona. It's a beautiful area. It's really central at the moment. But when you go there, it's strange because the density is lower, and you can see that there are a lot of architectural remains that comes from rural background. You can find public fountains, you can find a lot of trees, a lot of courtyards, and a lot of buildings that look more like countryside houses. The reason why this is happening is because Gracia used to be an independent village, rural one, completely rural, in which the people from Barcelona in the 18th century used to go on holidays for the summer, or the local agricultures were having their house. And over the 19th century, Barcelona absorbed that little village. So in this project, also it was very important in the modernist. The first Gaudí house is 2 minutes away from our building. And also it was a semi-industrial area in which artisan and craft ceramics were created. So all these elements that are a bit hiding in the moment in the building were stressed in the architecture we were creating. As you see, in the ceramics that we were using industrial ceramics. It was impossible to do any other thing for regulations. But then we were adding, as you will see, some hand painting on top of it, so that we are constantly introducing this idea of the semi-glaze and craft ceramics. Also, there is a lot of attention to details in the inside, bringing the idea of this hidden rural past to be celebrated in the interior. We try to use the figure of the tree in many different ways within the interior design, from lamps to handrails design that you will see, to wallpapers, so that over the building you can find around 20 to 30 hidden trees in the inside, done in different ways. Of course, the research of local identities is combined with the program of the co-working for a company that we have been collaborating in several projects, and we have a kind of expertise in this. Beside this idea of the hidden trees, we are working a lot in the customization of the industrial products. In here you see how these industrial elements, like the tables and chairs, has been painted by hand, so that the environment is completely different, and how the lamps are combining again craft elements like bicycle wheels that are creating the structures and textiles. And there are plenty of different spaces in here. And in here you see how the texture of the ceramics were done. It was me and my team dropping manually, painting on top of a €8 per square meter horrible ceramic that was chosen by the client for financial reasons. Obviously, it's a quite cheap building. And then how we were trying to reappropriate this idea, again hacking the industrial product with craft means, and how it's reintroduced in the space with this idea of discovering the hiding trees. Also, it's important for us to bring that notion from Naomi Shore of the details being the heritage of the female culture. And for that purpose, we were designing special spaces for private conversations, telephone, and also the reading of private emails in the balconies that are semi-separated from the interior design, also dealing with a social issue, but also with an environmental issue, dealing with this idea of the deep facade, the deep balconies, which are, again, a local identity in the neighborhood. So these balconies, as you see, they are not only creating a canopy that is 1.5 meters deep, so that it creates in the south enough shadow to protect the window hole, but it's also creating an resting and talking space that is isolated from the rest of the space. Here you see how it can work. And as I was saying, detailings bringing the feminine culture were not only applied to issues like the lamps or the balconies, but also to other details as the staircase handrail and the staircase production. These are some of the technical details of the staircase, and we were trying first to recover embroidery traditions. UNESCO is protecting some untouchable craft techniques, and embroidery is protected all over the world for different reasons, but usually it's always made by women. So that was something we wanted to bring back to the building, so that the handrail is completely embroidery by a woman called Raquel Rodriguez that is doing this kind of big format embroidery. And also the staircases are trying to fragment the structural elements into lighter elements that are reinforcing bars for the concrete, so that again we could go for a quite cheap construction with a quite light type of detail. Okay. And here you see some of the detailing of the building. And to end with the lecture, I would like to explain fast a last principle and some projects. Taking back or going back to my doctorate dissertation, I think it's really important the way we are starting a project. Our vision is that if a project is starting with generic ideas, conceptual approaches like a continuous space or a narrow space or spatial notions that has been long used in architecture, there is a very big chance that users, environmental side effect, or material culture is not taken on board in depth. So we are doing experiments with students and architects with the graphic reference that they are having, trying to bring as a preliminary graphic reference photography of photographers that are having an anthropological background, as Xavier Rivas, or that are looking at the body of people in detail, or that are looking at time as a major factor of the photography, trying to see if this is affecting the way in which we are dealing with image. We are trying to convince our students, and if we have any FEDA, so no, our colleagues, that for long we have been doing architecture like if we were looking at the beautiful side of a carpet, like the image of the carpet. So we were usually looking at form, image, style, space, or volumes. We are stepping out and seeing if what we are doing is fitting our visual references. But we are proposing to project and design looking at the backwards of the carpet. That is what is recommended when you are buying a good carpet. That is looking at the side effect, environmental impact, social capital, and political model and pattern that you are creating. We're saying, look at what is not physical and what is not visual in your project. Is this meaning that image is no any longer important? Yes, it is. It's longer important, and in fact, for us, the beauty of the building is important. But it's important as a way of engaging with others. So this would be a little bit like a visual figure of how we are trying to project. We are in the backside of the carpet. We try to see the environmental impact, social capital, political questions that our architecture is bringing. But we try to see how the image is put together in a way that is understandable, accessible, and engaging for others that are our audience. Very briefly, I'm going to show you a short selection of projects before the questions. I hope there are going to be a couple of questions at least. I'm saying that so that you can start thinking. And in this sequence of projects, we are trying to enlarge the notion of image. So that is mainly a communication issue. In this first project, they are very small project with that are not requiring a lot of explanation. We were working with integral definition of comfort, introducing in a basement for transforming it into a lecture hall, an acoustic ceiling that allows the transparency of the voice, no microphones were required, and also the intimacy, so that under each one of these cells, the sound of the close conversations were completely nice, and you were not listening to the other noises. We were also working with touch and soft materials, so that they are not only just contributing to absorb noise, but they were also allowing discussion, promoting a good, let's say, listening of the space. And we were looking at other non-visual considerations, like the presence of vegetation, and also the reinterpretation and understanding of an architecture coming from the 19th century in the center of Spain, of Madrid, in which, for example, there are very curious situations, like the brick being the foundation of the rock, of the stone, because the financial situation of Spain in that moment was a bit, let's say, we were poor. We have been poor a long part of our history. So that's creating a lot of architectural interesting details, and we were trying people to have access to that conditions. These are some of the acoustic ceiling details, combining boards, acoustic absorbing foam, textiles, and paper, so that this was created. Another way of dealing with this idea of image is what Abigail Houston is referring to as the recreative approach to art or to visual information. That is, Abigail says, the people that has a long culture and a long experience in looking at images find a double communication level in those images like paintings. In a first level, the painting and the image is acting as a friend. People feel comfortable, people feel reinforced by the view of an image that they recognize. And in a bigger level, people with this big culture of visual, this big visual culture are considering the whole ecology of the image, how it was put together, the period, the history, difficulties and trips that the image has had. So we are trying to work with this double communication level and this double condition of the image. For example, in projects in which we are using flowers as a main visual reference, New York project, as you remind, was based in a flower bouquet and an hydrogenia dome. And in here we were working with, again, 69 lamps that were having the configuration of a flower. Looking at Gertrude Jekyll, heritage, is a landscape designer from the 19th century, and she was looking at how the reposition of color within a garden could allow the understanding of the natural cycles and the seasons. So we are trying the flower image and the flower figure to be the friend of our audience, but also to allow our audience to consider the ecology of the figure. So in this project, we were using flowers and connecting them to Gertrude Jekyll as a female landscape designer. And in the next year, in the same pop-up event in Madrid, we were researching on Georgia O'Keeffe background in how she was scaling up some natural elements like flowers with the hope that that will be creating a time lapse in which we are observing things that we usually see very fast, and we could stop so that the time lapse will remind us of a garden and a natural experience without the need of a real landscape around. So we were introducing this kind of studies and research in the, let's say, refurbishment of a collective courtyard in a communal house in Spain that was a very decayed space, and we were introducing this as a launch area. So again, the flower figure happens here with two communication levels. On one hand, people say, okay, one more flower figure that I can recognize as, let's say, a product and a friend of the office and of the people that are following us. But then it's also having a whole ecology about the Native American culture and patterns, about the appreciation of nature, and about the whole Georgia O'Keeffe cultural background. And that's all. Thank you so much for the attention, and I hope you have nice questions. Thank you.